So I wanted to say some things about creativity. It's a subject that interests some people a lot, some people to some degree, and some people not at all. And the ordinary, everyday idea that most people have, I think, is that creativity is primarily something to do with certain disciplines, activities, careers, primarily the arts, and which includes, broad definition, entertainment, fine arts, all kinds of different art crafts. And in our time in Western culture, business. I think people think of doing well in business as a creative endeavor. If you want to start your own business, the idea is you have to have some creativity, not just ability. And that's generally the way the majority of people, I think of creativity. And then there are people who are thought of as kind of being born creative, a born painter, a born writer, a born actor. They kind of have creative abilities, creative skills. Either you're born with it or you learn it. You can cultivate it. And in general, in the general population, there's not much thought about it beyond that for most people. Obviously, if you're in the arts or if you're in business, you might think about it a little bit more than the average person. But the average person has a job. The job is only for the purpose of paying the rent and having food to eat. They're not thinking much about creativity. And then there's another type of person I've met many examples of who really aren't very creative, but they feel like they have a creative urge, so they do something and they are really kind of proud of it. They write poems, which in their case is just sentences that rhyme. Or they paint, but their paintings suck. But they proudly show them off to family and friends, and they like to think of it as, see, I have some creativity. So I'm just using that example as that to many people, many people think of it as a desirable quality. They would like to think they have it, even if they don't really have a particular skill or a particular innate ability, they kind of decide they do. I just can't even count all the people I've known who write poems that have nothing to do with poetry. Who wouldn't know what poetry was if you asked them, but to them it feels creative. So the point is simply that many people desire creativity or want to feel that they have some creative ability. And of course, then there's a whole other way of approaching it where people think of creativity as a particular approach to something. You come up with a creative solution to a problem. You think out of the box. You bring more to bear than you ordinarily would, and that amounts to a kind of a creativity where you can get something done that wouldn't have got done, or something gets resolved that wouldn't have gotten resolved otherwise. So these are simply the basic ways that we kind of hold the idea of creativity. And I want to refute that, because the title of this discourse is Creativity and Spirituality. And that, of course, suggests a question: what's the relationship between creativity and spirituality? And if you think of creativity in those ordinary senses, in the way most people think of creativity, creativity is something that an artist has, I don't necessarily have it. Or something a famous writer has, I don't necessarily have it. Then you are completely missing the spiritual definition of creativity. It's a required topic for spiritual seekers. If you are in spiritual life, then you have to know something about creativity. You have to think about creativity. You have to come up with the correct understanding of what the idea of creativity means. And you have to know the implications for you in spiritual life. So you have to forget about or simply set aside all those everyday definitions, everyday conceptions about creativity, and understand the spiritual definition of creativity, which of course, like everything else, is the only correct definition. It's the only one that has accuracy and truth, that pertains to what is real rather than what's just an idea about something. So the fact is, and it's something I've never spoken about, so it might be new to you. It may not, but it probably is. So open your mind creatively, because it's absolutely vital. It's absolutely vital you understand this. If you are a spiritual seeker, if you live any kind of spiritual life, if you consider yourself on a spiritual path, if you want God, if you seek truth, then you are required, not it's suggested, not it's recommended, you are required to be highly creative. The spiritual approach itself, the spiritual focus itself, is the creative approach. And if you don't think of it this way, and you probably don't, then I'm recommending you change the way you think of it and fold that into it. That to live a actually successfully get somewhere spiritual life, advance spiritually, grow spiritually, you must bring creativity into the mix. You must figure out, learn, and practice how to live creatively. Your spiritual life is a work of art. Your spiritual life is your creative canvas, is your creative arena. If you aren't living it with a sense of creating it, of creativity as a factor, then you're not doing everything you can do or doing your best to really get the most out of it and make the most out of it. You're not making the most out of it until you recognize, until you realize the creative aspect of spiritual life, the creative necessity that spiritual life literally implies. So let me give you my spiritual definition of creativity, which is not a negation of any ordinary definition of that word. It's just an expansion. So the real creativity, and it includes all artistic endeavor and creative endeavor, the real creativity is the willingness and ability to respond to any given situation with the maximum awareness you can bring to bear in that moment, both inner and outer, awareness of yourself and awareness of the circumstances. In other words, your response, your spontaneous response to every moment of life or to a particular moment of life is the creative response. Not a preset response, not a, I did it 100 times this way, so I'm doing it again this way. It is the alive response to this moment and the circumstances of this moment. And that is about as creative, about as high a creative challenge as you can ever set, because you have to really bring real creativity to bear, whatever else you're bringing to bear, awareness, perception, intelligence, consciousness. If you leave out creativity, if you're not consciously bringing in the creative element, you are not giving yourself every benefit of how to live this moment. You're leaving out the part that gives you wings. You're leaving out the part that allows you to make something more, make the maximum of it, make it juicier, make it fuller. That's an art. It's a creative art. It's living art. It's performance art. So generally this isn't discussed in this way. You can go to 100 spiritual meetings and talk about every aspect of spiritual life, and highly likely you won't hear the word creativity mentioned. But that's, for whatever reason, is the way it is. It's simply an omission, because creativity has to be included. You have to understand that a spiritual person, a person trying to live, intending to live, living a spiritual life, is involved in a creative endeavor, is required by the nature of what it is to bring creativity into that moment and that situation, and allow your maximum natural creativity to be able to be brought to bear, be used, be implemented, be part of the situation. So it's interesting because of what I said earlier. Most people think of themselves, I'm creative, I'm not. I paint and I draw, so I'm creative. I write books besides my day job, so I'm creative. And then other people, well, I work in a factory, I'm not creative. I'm a housewife, I'm not creative. But the spiritual-minded person and the one in spiritual life can't have that kind of thinking, can't afford that kind of everyday limited idea, because your most creative choice in life is when you choose spiritual life. Then you've chosen the same way as the artist, the same way as the writer, the same way as the poet. You've chosen a life that is based on the creative approach. Does that compute so far? So it has to be recognized, because if you're in the category of, oh, I know I'm creative, you may not be bringing that view of yourself into your spiritual life. And if you're in the category, the larger category of, well, I'm not that creative, artists are, painters are, dancers are, but I'm not, then you can't afford to keep that thought. You have to recognize that your spiritual practices, your spiritual interests, your spiritual activities require a creative consciousness, require you to bring a consciously creative mindset into the mix. And you can't do that if you hold on to the belief that you're not creative. The act of identifying yourself as a spiritual seeker, the simply self-identification, I'm spiritual, literally requires that you include, sooner or later, that's why I'm explaining it, the notion that therefore I must be creative. Whether I feel creative or not, I must live creatively, act in a creative manner, bring creativity into my spiritual endeavor. Otherwise, I'm leaving out an important ingredient in the recipe. You know, if you're cooking a certain dish that has 5 ingredients and you leave out one of the main ones, it's not the dish you're going for. Spirituality is like that in terms of creativity. If you're leaving out the idea of creativity and the purposeful employment of a more creative approach, then you're leaving out a main ingredient that you can't afford to leave out and still call it soup. It'll be something, but it won't be soup. If you're making soup and you leave out, if you're making vegetable soup and you leave out the vegetables, it isn't vegetable soup. So this is under the heading of be all that you can be spiritually. And to do that, you have to start understanding and employing this notion of creativity. So the creative approach doesn't mean you have to have artistic ability, doesn't mean you do things more elegantly than you would normally, doesn't mean you add a flair you didn't have before, doesn't mean you get more involved in it in a certain particular kind of way. It just means that you recognize and understand a very basic element that goes against, on the surface, sounds like it contradicts what I've said again and again many times before about the spiritual path. So let me say it again, and then you'll see how it, on the surface, seems to contradict, but of course it really doesn't. Again and again, I've told you the spiritual path is not a made-up thing. It's not you create it as you go. It isn't arbitrary. It isn't a choice. There is an actual spiritual path, and there's only one. Now, it comes in many forms. That's why it seems like there's all kinds of spiritual paths. It's valid to say there are all kinds, but it has to be understood what that means. It's valid to say there's only one. It's valid to say there are many. But it has to be understood, and both understandings are the same, which is there's actually only one, which means that unless it meets certain criteria, fulfills certain requirements, it isn't the actual or a valid spiritual path. When I say there's only one spiritual path, what I mean is that set of requirements that defines what makes it the actual spiritual path. Now, on top of that, you can do that in endless different forms. Those requirements can be met this way, that way, that way. It can be met in January, it can be met in December. There's not a tied down, can only be this way order and particular way it's constructed. It's more the idea that there are actual requirements, what I often refer to as thresholds, that have to be met. And those get met by different traditions in different ways and in different order. Some emphasize one thing more or earlier than another. And others include a more liberal approach where you have a choice. Well, you can address it this way, or that way. And others are very one way. No, this is how you do it. But that's the form on top. The form on top, you have some choice about. The form on top is more flexible. But the underlying imperatives don't have any exceptions. Either they're met or they're not. Either the requirements are fulfilled or they're not yet. And if you really, and there are scholars who have done this, who do this for a lifetime, who have studied all the different spiritual traditions and have kind of mapped out what are the underpinnings, the similarities that they all share. And that's a way of categorizing the requirements. Of course, most of those scholarly studies have it all wrong, but that's a whole other subject. So, because they're interpreting rather than operating with truth itself. So, when you hear me say that, and I really say it often and I really emphasize it, then it can sound like there's no creativity in it. And what I'm saying now is unless you bring creativity to bear consciously, unless you are operating creatively, unless you are conducting yourself and your response to the outer circumstances, whatever they are at any given moment, creatively, you are not really doing the whole spiritual deal. You're doing even most of it, but you're not doing all of it. That's the last piece that has to be absolutely added to be able to say, I'm doing everything I can do. I'm using my full abilities to further my spiritual life, to increase my spiritual understanding and develop and cultivate my spiritual awareness. So that creativity is spontaneous when it's at its best. When you're really using it, it's a spontaneous affair. So it's not always that easy when you're first hearing it and think about it to reconcile the fact that there's these set requirements that don't change, that have always been the same, always will be the same, that are the same on other planets, that are the same in other galaxies, that are the same in other realities. And yet there's this creative aspect that has a wide berth and that lets you, really requires you to make it up in the moment, to give a fuller response than you might ordinarily, to, in that sense, be both more present and more aware than you ordinarily are used to. So these two aren't contradictory. That's how you fulfill the requirements creatively, by getting creative enough in your approach to life and your approach to the living moment that without really focusing on it, that mindset itself almost guarantees that you'll fulfill most, if not all, basic requirements of the true spiritual path. So the two are highly linked. They're not at all two different subjects, spirituality and creativity, that you can link up and you can see the crossover and you can see how they're connected. They're essential. They're not just interconnected, they come together. You can't have one without the other. All creativity is a spiritual endeavor, whether the person who's carrying it out or even the group that's carrying it out recognizes it or not. But we're not so much concerned with that as your individuality and the fact that as a spiritual person, let's call it, you are obligated to develop a particular kind, at the very least, a particular kind of creativity, which is the creativity of how you do life, how you do this moment, how you do you. And that can only be fully fulfilled, the most possible fulfilled, adequately handled by consciously understanding that that is a creative action. It isn't just a decision. It isn't just a behavior. It isn't just a response. It has to be a very creative response, a very plastic ability in you that you can easily, without any difficulty, respond very differently than you have in the past to the exact same thing, because this moment demands something very different, even though the circumstances look the same. So that's the real creativity, your ability to respond in a manner that is correct for you, optimal for you, for the circumstances, and for everyone else. It's the optimized approach, you could say, where you're taking, in a split second, you're, in a sense, intuitively, but it's about awareness, taking everything into consideration, and your action is determined by all those factors: what's right for you, what's appropriate and best for the circumstances, and what's good for everybody. All three have equal weight, in other words, so that you're not the deciding factor. The good of the whole is not the deciding factor, and the necessities of the circumstance are not the deciding factor. All three are equal ingredients of that soup. And if that isn't creative, I don't know what is. That's high level operating. That's handling life in a seriously creative way. That's being open for real. That's not trying to control and truly going with the flow for really real. Not the way people mean it, which usually means a more subterfuge way of controlling. When they say, oh, I'm going with the flow, what they really mean is things are the way I like, so it's easy. This is things aren't the way you like, so you don't let what you like and dislike determine your response. You actually rise higher in the moment than your personal view would suggest or would ordinarily make you do. Your response is higher level. Your openness is bigger. Your willingness to see everything from a more expanded view is actually coming into play. You're allowing that. You're not looking through a narrow view. You're taking the widest possible view and maintaining an inner and outer awareness, both. Whereas in the ordinary, everyday, half asleep approach, you're kind of more aware of how you feel or more aware of what's going on outside you, and it's very skewed, therefore. This is where you're taking out all the skewing and you're simply making everything important at the same time. And that is nothing more and nothing less than the creative way. You're leaving nothing out, and you're demanding that nothing be kept in. You're willing for all factors to be determining factors. You're not prearranging your ideas or your actions. You are really, really letting yourself be part of things. You're participating in a more real way, in a more engaged way, and by definition, that means a more creative way. By definition. How can you not be more engaged, more participatory, more in it, and that's not more creative? Of course it's more creative. But you have to accept this idea of creativity in the spiritual sense so that you can do it consciously. You can't wait for it to just, oh, well, I'll see if I'm actually being creative spiritually. You have to bring it in. You have to have that as your purpose. It's your purpose to be more actively creative in how you do you, how you do life, which is how you do your spirituality. The most basic definition is they can't be separated. You can't say, well, here's my spiritual life and here's the rest of my life. All this is what everybody does all the time. And that's kind of borne out in experience. It doesn't matter. It's not true. The real measure of your spiritual life is your life. The real measure of your spiritual awareness is what you do every day, what you do every moment, how you talk to your wife or your husband or your kids, how you conduct yourself with the people around you, how you respond to the situations that life brings every single day. That's the measure of your spiritual life, not did you meditate for 20 minutes or for 40 minutes this morning. So creativity is the basis, it turns out. Creativity is the basis of spiritual life lived all the way. If you never think about the word creativity, but you live your spiritual life really all the way, you'll stumble on it. You'll start thinking about some words that suggest the idea of creativity. But instead of waiting for that to happen accidentally, I'm recommending that you adopt this notion that creativity is an essential element of true spiritual life, and that you see yourself, when you say, I'm a spiritual seeker, to yourself or to anyone, that you see yourself as, therefore, I am trying to operate as creatively as I'm able. I'm trying to have a more holistic, take it all into consideration approach, and I'm trying to have the optimal response from my side. And of course, that's more creative than just your response is whatever your response is, or whatever's right for you, or whatever basis you're operating on otherwise. So it's creativity in action. It's not creating a painting that then can be hung on the wall, writing a book that can then be read by others. It's lived. It's your life itself. It's how you expand yourself and how you increase your consciousness. It's how you rise higher. It can't happen. You can't rise higher without being more creative. And many of you have risen higher without realizing that you were being more creative, and that's why things advanced. You don't have that missing piece of understanding. That's why I wanted to say some things about it, to give you that. So it's absolutely basic. It's absolutely must be understood, must be incorporated, must be accepted, and cannot be ignored and just go with the ordinary ideas of what does creativity mean, what does that word imply, and what does that mean for me. Spiritual life means you have chosen to live more creatively. Spiritual focus means that you have agreed to bring a more creative intent to whatever it is you're doing. You have already agreed, you did already sign up for this, you just probably didn't know it. And you're definitely already doing it, but you probably aren't calling it creativity. So it's better if you call it that. It's better if you recognize it for what it is, because then you can do it more consciously. Then you can recognize that instead of telling yourself, I'm not doing it good enough, you can understand that, well, being creative isn't that easy, and I'm not going to be perfect at it right out of the gate. Or the first time I try to do it this expanded way, I might not feel like I'm succeeding all the way. So that you are less hard on yourself and less judging yourself when all that's going on is you're doing what most people aren't doing, which is trying to approach it more creatively, whatever it is. If you're spiritually minded, I guarantee you, you are trying to approach things more creatively than the average person is doing, than the conventional person is doing. Conventionality, by definition, almost can be defined as operating in the least creative way possible. Just follow the crowd. Just do what everybody else is doing. Just believe what everybody else believes. Don't think for yourself. Don't see for yourself. I mean, isn't that the opposite of creativity? So it's easy to understand, and I don't probably have to say to you that if you're a person who would say, I have a spiritual life, that you're not really living conventionally anymore. That probably I don't need to explain, but I probably do need to explain that that also means you're trying to live more creatively. That non-conventional, by definition, again, by definition, means you are seeking to employ a more creative approach and a more creative entire response to whatever it is. You are trying to enter the situation, live the moment more creatively. There'd be no way you could call it spiritual unless that were true, because it's just part of it. But you need that word. You need that word creativity. You need to see it as a creative circumstance. because it'll simply help you understand what you're doing. You're already doing it. I'm not telling you do something you're not already doing. I'm telling you understand this aspect of it and do it more consciously. Do it more with the understanding that it isn't about doing it right or doing it wrong or not making mistakes, because the creative process has wide room for mistakes. The greatest artists who ever lived all used the same canvas 20 times because they didn't like what they did the first time, so they used it again, painted something else, something else, something else. And that's how you have to do life, as not fretting when it didn't turn out exactly as you ideally would want, and simply recognizing that the canvas is always there, that you don't have a finite or a limited opportunity. If you live another moment, you have another opportunity. Not to do it better, for that creativity to be more helpful, for that creativity to help you actually be more engaged. More creative means more engaged, not holding back, not waiting for somebody else to do it or waiting for the right answer, but simply taking the chance. It's obviously more challenging, more risky. You are taking a bigger chance when you lift that paintbrush and put some paint on the canvas than if you just keep looking at that blank canvas, because now you've made a commitment and you've got to follow where that goes. Now one door is closed. So it's a more challenging way to live. It's a more challenging way to approach the artwork that is this living moment. So I'm wanting very much to convince you that you are an artist. That however you think of yourself, you should not think of yourself as a spiritual person without including the concept, the understanding that there's a artistic side to that. By artistic, I mean creative. That you are creating for real, and that no matter how predefined, you can be in a spiritual tradition where everything is just laid out. There's plenty of them. At 6 a.m. you do this, and at 7 you do that, and even the most regimented form of spiritual path has all the room in the world for creativity, because it has to, because your creativity determines to a large degree your ability to move forward, your ability to rise higher. So it's never out of play. It's never determined by the particular spiritual format. It's a base element of spiritual life. I think I made that point. So for some, that's good news. Hey, I'm an artist. Who knew? For some, that's in a way bewildering. Well, I'm not an artist. This is not good news because I'm not that creative and sounds like something I wouldn't be good at. But your spiritual life is all we're talking about. Your spiritual experiencing is what we're talking about. That experience is a creative situation. How you handle it, how you live it, what's your response to it, what is your interpretation of it, what do you do with it, what do you do with it in the living moment, and what do you do with it in the next moment, is a creative endeavor. You are absolutely responsible the way the artist is responsible for the painting and the author is responsible for the piece of literature. You're absolutely responsible for how it comes out. So if you don't like the idea that it's has to be creative and that you're required to be creative and that you're creating whether you want to or not, it doesn't matter if you don't like that idea. You have to accept it. You really have to. It's like saying, I don't want to accept sitting behind a wheel, but I want to drive a car. Well, they go together. You can't have one without the other. So when I say understand that you're an artist, that's all I mean. That you are absolutely responsible for the creative nature of the spiritual living. You're responsible for your individual brand of it. Yours may be in watercolors, and yours may be in oils, and yours may be in pastels. There is an individual element. That's the creative part. But you're all drawing the same picture, or same genre of picture. So the idea, I'm not creative, has to be dropped if you're spiritually involved. It has to be included that this is creativity itself. One of the main reasons it's not easy to see is other types of creativity, the ordinary, more everyday definitions of creativity, usually are connected to an end result, to a product, a painting, a book, a dance choreography, something that can be seen by others, something that can be identified and categorized. In the spiritual view of creativity and the spiritual creativity, the product is your life and you. Your consciousness, your presence, your energy. What people, you could narrow it to what people feel when you walk in the room. That wouldn't be inaccurate. Are you adding something, or are you bringing the whole thing down? So there's no material product like other types of creative endeavors. The material product is your consciousness. So it's not material. It's, are you creatively increasing and expanding your being? Are you richer than you were? Are you a more beautiful work of art than you were before? Are you more attractive as an artwork to more people than you were before? Are you judgeable by most people as more beautiful than they would have called you before? Because how do we talk about artworks as beautiful, as they make us feel something, as having a certain effect on us? It's the same. What effect are you having? What effect are you having on life, on this world, on the people who meet you? So there's no way to talk about creativity. There's not any aspect or way that you can ever talk about creativity that doesn't include the spiritual view of it. It all fits. It isn't two views. There's the everyday view that has to do with art. Some people have it, some people don't. And then there's the spiritual definition, like I was saying. And those are two different things. They're not. The everyday view is simply part of the spiritual view. The everyday understanding is more limited. The understanding I want you to have is a lot more broad. But it has to get personal. You have to see yourself as involved in a creative process. You have to see yourself as responsible for creativity. for your approach being more creative than you are taught by society, by teachers, by your family. Unless you were raised by a bunch of artists, you probably weren't taught to, per se, to be more creative. But in spiritual life, you have to teach yourself. It's on-the-job training. You have to rise to the more creative challenge again and again. Unlike painting a picture or writing a book, you're not done after the product is finished. It's a living canvas. So the challenge is very dynamic, because as soon as you meet the challenge, another moment comes and you have to meet it again. But what happens, just like an artist who paints, or a dancer, or a singer, or any other type of artistic endeavor, you get better at it with practice, and it becomes second nature. And you start living in a more automatically creative way without having to focus on it or think about it so much, or having to consciously employ the idea of creativity and being as creative as you're able. You simply develop the habit of a more creative approach, of being a more expanded perspective no matter what. It becomes your way. They talk about the artist's way. This is the spiritual person's way. It is the artist's way. But you don't have to have a special talent for it. If you did, then only certain people could be spiritual. But it's open to anybody. So it means what it implies, that everyone has enough creativity by the fact that they're born to be able to do this. Otherwise, literally, spirituality would be by application. You fill out an application and either you're fit for it or you're not. Either you're accepted or you're rejected. But there's nowhere to apply, and all are welcome. So that obviously means that everyone has enough of this quality to get it done, to do it, to make it consciously part of their spiritual activity. That the idea someone's more creative, someone's less creative, doesn't enter into how creativity has to be part of spiritual living. You simply have enough by definition. You have enough creativity. The question is, are you using it? Are you bringing it up and bringing it to bear? Are you making it part of the situation from your side? Are you including it in all your aspects that you bring to the table in any given moment? Because if you think about it, it's not difficult to figure out what you bring to bear. That you do bring certain things to the table, typically for you, in any given moment. And they tend to be somewhat habitual. Some people use more of their mind. They have a sharp intelligence, so generally they bring intelligence to the table and a kind of a clarity and a kind of figuring out approach. Other people bring a whole different set of qualities to the table. Some people are more heart-based and they bring a more kind of loving attitude and more of a softness. And you can think of people you can think of yourself, and well, this is kind of the 3 or 4 elements they bring to the table, and this is more how they are, what they bring to the table. What I'm saying is that if you're spiritual, and of course I only talk to spiritual people, so that means every one of you. If you're spiritual, then one of those elements, whether you've recognized it before or not, or think it's a good idea or not, has to be creativity. It has to be consciously cultivated. It has to be part of how you view what you do, what you have to do. To do spiritual, you must do it in a creative manner, or else it doesn't legitimately qualify as truly spiritual. If you can't identify the creativity in it, then it might not, then you might be fooling yourself that there's something spiritual about it. You might be taking something that's really ordinary or really conventional and sticking a spiritual label on it. So it's kind of, in a sense, in that sense, it's a measurement. Creativity is a hallmark of the spiritual way. I don't think I'm confusing anybody, right? So let's flesh it out a little bit more. So it means you can't have what you would like to have, what gives a certain false comfort and false sense of some security. You can't have a preset approach, because a preset approach is non-creative, uncreative. If you have a preset approach, you've already decided, you've already set it up that creativity isn't going to be much involved in this. So think back to the definition I gave you. If it's creative by spiritual definition, from the spiritual sense of the definition, it has to do with spontaneity. It has to do with responding in this moment to whatever is going on inside you and outside you. And there's no room for a preset response, because that's not at all taking into account what's going on inside you and outside you in this moment. That's deciding ahead of time, or assuming or anticipating what you think will be going on, and therefore you already have your response ready. You can't rehearse creativity. You can't rehearse openness. It means allowing the vulnerability and allowing the shakiness of it and enjoying it as a joyride, that there's a creative thrill in it. There's a rush of when it goes well, when the pieces all kind of fit. Just like creating an artwork. So it's a kind of a perpetual surfing. It's like you have to accept that you're born on a surfboard and you're required to surf. And just because you don't call it surfing doesn't mean you're not. So that's a good, simple understanding of what it means to be creative. You're, in the spiritual sense, you're doing it, whether you recognize it or not, and you can probably do it better if you recognize it. When you're seeing everything that's going on much more, when you're seeing that this is a creative situation rather than this is just this situation. So it absolutely involves seeing many more possibilities in the moment, in the given set of circumstances. And again, by definition, how is that not being creative? If you can see 30 possibilities where ordinarily you'd see 2 or 3, by definition, that's a more creative approach. So I'm trying to make a few little points clear so that you don't get stuck on you don't get confused on the notion of what's creative versus what's artistic. Artistic skill is not required for this. Aesthetic skill, aesthetic sensibility is not required for this. Creative ability, which you already have if you're a living human being, is what's required. The ability to respond for real. What will you ever and can you ever do in any given moment more creative than respond for real with all of you, with all of yourself, with as much as you can in that moment? You're going to have to tell me something that's more creative than that, because I don't know of anything more creative than that. In his most creative moment with his greatest masterpiece, Rembrandt or Picasso weren't doing more than that. And you're a spiritual seeker, so you have to be doing that all the frickin' time. You have to be Picasso every day, Rembrandt all the time. Rembrandt could take a vacation. Picasso could not paint for a couple of days, although that never happened. But you can't afford that. You're required to be creative all the time. That's the spiritual imperative. And when it becomes not only acceptable and intelligible to you, but familiar and easy and natural, then you will absolutely feel a lot of joy from it. It will give you very, very enjoyable feelings. You'll feel like the surfer who is riding a wave really a long time, really well. It's a nice feeling. So there's nothing to lose, certainly, but it has to be understood the right way, that it's part of the whole game. It's not optional. It's not for creative people only. There are no uncreative people. It doesn't exist. A living person is a well of creativity. Survival on any level takes massive creativity, day in, day out. Massive creativity. Who's not creative enough? Those who didn't survive. But that doesn't include you. You're in a different category. So expand your idea of creativity to include your spiritual self, and expand your idea of your spiritual life to include a creative necessity is always involved. Now, hearing all this, sooner or later, if you think about it right now or later or tomorrow, your mind will sooner or later ask yourself, well, but how do I implement this? There's going to be times where I'm not going to be sure how to be creative or what that means. And that's a little bit of a mind game. It's probably not as true as it seems when you'll have that thought, or if you're having it now. So a few people are having it now. It's really not true, because you're making it into a bigger deal than it is. That thought suggests that there's something really difficult in it. Challenging, yes. Difficult, not if you're an alive human being, because you've got enough creativity naturally. You've already proven it by surviving this far. So it's a little bit of a mind trick to think that it's too challenging, or I won't know how to figure it out in some circumstances, because it's less of a figuring out and more of a allowing more of you to be really participating, more vulnerable, more open, and therefore more responsive. But I want to offer you, in case your mind tricks you successfully and there's a moment where you're trying to be creative and you're not sure how, I want to give you a method that will always work. So if you're wanting in any given moment to be more creative because you somehow have a feeling, I could be more creative, I'm not being as creative as I could be in this circumstance, in this moment, as all that I am. And I really would like to, and don't know how. You have to approach it indirectly. In that moment, your mind won't let you, your wisdom mind even, won't, your regular mind won't let your wisdom mind come into play so that you can bring a more creative aspect to bear. That's what it means if you're struggling. It means your regular mind isn't allowing your wisdom mind. So you can go around that whole thing. You can do it indirectly. You can use a tricky approach. If you want to be more creative and you don't know how, and you consciously recognize in this moment, I want to be more creative in it, you simply ask yourself, what would love do? You simply choose love. You forget all about creativity, and in that moment, choose love. You will respond more creatively. Computare. Isn't that creative? I'm making up a language. There's no such word. It's not in any language. But you knew what I meant. You just choose love. That's the simplest creative approach. And when you choose love, aren't you instantly more open? Aren't you instantly more present? Aren't you instantly bringing more of yourself? Aren't you instantly more aware of what's inside you and outside you? Aren't you instantly considering all the factors more? So it's a trick that isn't a trick. The real creative approach always leads to love, but you can use it inductively. You can simply, when you want to be creative and don't know how, you can just be love. You can just choose love in that moment, and that will guarantee a creative opening. That will guarantee a more creativity is going to come into it. So you don't have to break your brain on this idea of creativity and I need more to employ that more. If it's becoming a struggle, if it's something that's becoming too mental, you just exchange the word creativity for the phrase, now choose love. In this moment, choose love. And then you can't go wrong. So you can never use an excuse with me after hearing this that I wasn't able to be creative enough, or I tried to be more creative and it didn't work. Well, then you forgot to just forget the whole thing and just choose love, and love will take care of it. You'll be more creative instantly. You'll be involved in a bigger flow without trying. So I'm really trying hard to take away all your excuses. This is one more peg, one more brick out of that wall. The day is not that far away that you'll have no excuses left. I'll have them all in my little bag, and you can't reach in. I'm collecting them from you, and you're not getting them back. It's a one-way street. And this is one of the final requirements, by the way. Creativity. This is towards the end of the list of what has to be understood to know what are the true requirements of spiritual life. I've talked about the majority of them now. This was one of the last ones left that I haven't mentioned at all. There's a couple more, but I'll get to those in the next month or two. And then I've given you the whole list. Then you have no excuse left on that score that you haven't been told and explained in depth what are the imperatives of spiritual life that I am required to fulfill. I've told you the majority already, many times over, because there aren't that many. And creativity has to be towards the end of that discussion. If it's toward the beginning, it'll confuse you. That's why it's coming now, not a year ago or 3 years ago, because it is not the linchpin of the list. It's just essential, but it isn't a watershed. It isn't do this first because it's more important, because you're going to do it anyway. You've been doing it all along. But at some point, it has to be put in front of you that the name for this is creativity, and that's what I'm doing tonight. So when you look at the three elements of the traditional form of spiritual life, the teacher, the guru, the spiritual community, and the spiritual quest itself, then you see that that's a dynamic, creative trio. You see that the requirement is that as the spiritual one, that you relate to each of those in its own uniquely creative way. Obviously, it's not the same, your relationship with the guru as your relationship with the community, as your relationship with your own quest or your own discipleship, or however you think of it. So there's no part of the spiritual reality, spiritual actuality, that doesn't include the creative process being adjusted upward, being potentiated to be as creative as you know how. You have to relate to the guru creatively. You have to relate to your fellow spiritual seekers creatively. You have to relate to your own spiritual search creatively, to your own process, to your own discipleship, whatever terminology fits for what you're doing. And it's never not in play in that sense. You can't rest on your laurels in any given area and say, okay, I've accomplished it now. That's not creative. That's saying, I'm finished. That's taking it to the cemetery. So as long as you're alive, and as long as you're spiritually moving, and as long as you're spiritually aware, you are doing best by operating as consciously in creative mode as you can. That you see yourself as involved and engaging in a creative activity, not a practice. Spiritual practice is a phenomenally creative activity, but you think of it as work. Generally, we think of it as work. We experience it as work. The truth is, it's the highest creativity. Sadhana is the highest work of art. Your spiritual practice done rightly actually takes you to God. What's a higher work of art than that? Actually summons truth. That's what all art is trying to do. So when I say you have to see yourself as an artist, I'm really not kidding. I'm not being cute. It's not a nice turn of phrase, but I don't really mean it. I do mean it. You have to be your own artist, and you are your own work of art, and you're creating it. And in all those dimensions, and in everyday life, so that you're talking about really every facet of your life experience is involved and is part of that canvas. So this is not in any way a small thing. Not the primary, most highest priority thing, but vital, necessary. So I want you to leave this discourse with a heightened sense of your own creativity, with the fact that for you to even ever have come to a point that you are calling yourself spiritual in any way, as an adjective, as a noun, spiritual seeker or spiritual, that one of the reasons more people aren't labeling themselves that way and aren't interested in that is because they cannot rise to the creative necessity unconsciously understood and implied in it. You did. Otherwise, you could never have used the word spiritual about yourself. That shows that a creative process was successfully engaged and employed to have gotten to that point where you first started referring to yourself openly as spiritual, in any open way, even limited. So I'm trying to get rid of the notion that's in some of people's minds and it's going to take a while to get rid of, that somehow this doesn't apply to you because you're not really that creative. It's got nothing to do with it. Those ideas have nothing to do with this. You are spiritually creative. That's all there is to it. Conventional people who will never stumble on any actual spiritual anything consciously in an aware way, part of the reason is they're simply truly not interested, not ready, not able. But another part of the reason is they actually don't have enough creative potential. Everybody has enough, but they haven't activated enough for that to be possible. Because it happened for you, that's the proof that you did activate enough. Enough of your creative, natural power that you were able to climb into the spiritual window, go through the spiritual door. It requires a greater creative license to find that door. There are those who try to find it and don't. And there are those who are never going to try. That's the vast majority. That doesn't mean they don't have enough creativity. But for many it does. It means they haven't activated it. They haven't engaged it in any meaningful way. They haven't allowed it to be alive for them, in them. But you have. The proof is how you see yourself, how you define yourself as engaged spiritually. So you came to this talk assuming you'd hear something about creativity, but you probably didn't think that I want you to walk out seeing yourself as an artist. But I absolutely do. Spiritual artist. You are creating your spiritual actuality. And that is one of the ongoing required activities of the true spiritual path. That is part of the responsibility and part of the requirement, that you actively do that yourself. Nobody can, for the simple reason, nobody can do it for you. The same way as nobody can take a pee for you, only you can. It's exactly the same. No matter how much somebody would like to do it for you and you would like to not be bothered, it can't be any other way. It's simply not set up to be any other way. Nobody can digest your food, nobody can go to the bathroom for you, and nobody can do your creativeness. You have to do it. Yeah, you engage it. You bring it to bear. You allow it to be accessed. You don't tell yourself, well, I'm doing my best. You ask yourself, am I doing my best? Does that include that I'm being as consciously creative in my approach as I know how? And many times the answer will be, oh, I guess I wasn't. because we're not trained to be readily bringing creativity into the mix. We're trained to be conventional, which is the uncreative approach. Do it the way it's always done. And if possible, figure it out ahead of time. And the spiritual creative approach is you can't figure out ahead of time, because when the time comes, it's a different time. What you figure out ahead of time can't apply, because that was then and this is now. So just for the future, since I can't talk to you, dialogue, you're not allowed to say anything because it's a discourse, but I can have you raise your hand. Should we address this more in the future? In other words, will you have questions that you can retain, or have we kind of done it? If you think that you might have some questions to ask at a future date, you can't ask them now, it's discourse. At a future date, raise your hand. Nobody has a single question. Cool. Okay, there'll be one. So you remember it for when you're allowed to. Don't try to talk. It's not allowed. There's one last thing. This also relates somewhat to what I was talking about the other day, how people tend to hold the guru. And having said all this, let me just put that little piece at the end, that generally you see the guru as the artist and not you. You see the guru as the one who's doing something creative and you're just along for the ride, trying to get as much as you can get. Just stop that kind of thinking. I mean, hopefully this talk helps you put that aside, put that away, drop it entirely, and realize that you're the artist. You're the one who has to be truly creative. I have to be creative as the guru, but it's not big stakes for me. I'm not being the guru to move forward in some way myself. You're trying to move forward. The stakes are on your side. So you have to be recognizing that it's your creativity that has to come in. My creativity and any creativity I can bring to bear is not going to be a deciding factor. Your creativity is always going to be the deciding factor for you. So don't do this natural mind thing that minds do of, well, the guru's the artist, the guru's the creative one, and I'm trying to learn from, at very best, trying to learn from them. I'm the apprentice. Disciple is an apprentice somehow trying to learn how to be more creative. No, you can't afford that kind of thinking. You haven't got the time for it. You've got to be mustering your creativity much more for real than that, and not waiting for somebody else to do for you what only you can do. Okay? Well, good you didn't say okay, because you're not allowed to talk. Because I was going to trick you and say, I can't hear you. I'm not going to trick you. Okay.